The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
So our sermon today, we're going into the realm of Solomon. We're going to be studying 1 Kings. And before we get there, it's interesting to note that for 40 years, the Israelites wandered in the wilderness without a king. So 40 years to and fro in the desert without a king head figure, a single person for leadership. Their leadership consisted of Moses, the Spirit of God, and the elders of the tribes in representation. And priests, right. When the people of Israel first got to the promised land, and remember Moses didn't make it, so Moses is out of the picture at this point, they were still loosely organized in the 12 tribes of Judah, right? So how is it that they ended up with a single king over everyone, over those 12 tribes?
Well, it took kind of a while, and one of the important questions to ask is not just how did it happen, but why did it happen? So this gathered group of 12 tribes comes into the promised land, and they've got their 12 tribes, and they're all pretty independent. They divide up the land, they've all got their own say over their own land, but all the people that are already living there, who weren't all conquered, there were still some Canaanites there. Read about the Canaanites all the time in the Bible. The Canaanites lived this totally different life. They had little city-states and they had kings. Every little city-state had a king. And the king had control, but the king also protected you, but the king did other things. The Canaanites were very different from the Israelites. For one thing, they were wealthier. They were more sophisticated. They lived in much nicer homes. You know, the Israelites were still kind of nomads, but the Canaanites had these beautiful homes. And they didn't worship Yahweh, of course, they worshipped the Baals. The Baals were basically agricultural type gods. They were gods of fertility. So a farmer, where is Connor?
Probably in the ocean.
Okay. So a farmer who has planted his crops and wants to have a successful harvest would go to his neighborhood shrine. He would have relations with the shrine's priestess prostitute. And he was assured that as he had sex with her, the divine Baal was having sex with his divine consort, and this was fertilizing the entire world, and his crops would do well. And this was the theology behind it. So it's kind of a fun system for the men. The Israelites had nothing to match it for fun. We might have to edit this a lot more. But this is the truth. They didn't have 10 commandments. You know, they didn't have anything that really restricted people. And so, other than the fact that you're surrounded by neighbors who are doing quite well, so you might see them and think, I'll do what they do, and I can become more successful somehow. There's also just that it was a lot easier path in that sense. So the Israelites came to, actually, there's a period of judges. After Joshua dies, there were what were called judges. They weren't just judges like we think of, although they did settle civil disputes and that sort of thing. But they were also military leaders. They were individuals, and they were lifted up for a period of time, not for life or anything. There were both men and women, even as military leaders. And one in particular named Gideon was very successful, and just very successful military leader. And the people wanted to name him king. They asked him to be their king. And Gideon said, no, I won't be your king, and my sons won't be your kings, and no one is going to, the Lord is your king. That's how this works. The Lord is your king. Gideon had a better understanding than most of God's power and protection for him. The stories about Gideon and his successful military things are stories of going out against an enemy and being told to send most of his troops back home and going after far greater numbers of enemies with a very small force, so that it was absolutely evident that they won only because of God's hand, not because of their military might or anything. So the people still wanted, they said, okay, Gideon won't be our king, but we still want a king. They ended up going to Samuel. Samuel was a great prophet. He was very respected and loved. He was elderly. He had two sons who were also judges, actually, but they were kind of scoundrels. Nobody wanted them to be king. But they went to Samuel and they said, anoint a king for us. Well, Samuel didn't really want anything to do with this. And he went to God in prayer, and God basically told him what to say. I'm going to read for you what answer God sent back to the people of Israel. So Samuel reported all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, "These will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots and to be his horsemen and to run before his chariots. And he'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and to reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards and give them to his couriers. He'll take 1/10 of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his couriers. He'll take your male and female slaves and the best of your cattle and donkeys and put them to his work. He'll take 1/10 of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. And in that day you will cry out because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day." This was supposed to discourage the people from wanting a king. All these bad things are going to happen if you become king. But it didn't discourage them. They still insisted. So Samuel found Saul. Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel. And then not too long after that, Saul was replaced by David, who became the second king of Israel, who was also anointed by Samuel. And they didn't really live up to that bad prophecy. They, had some things they did, but they didn't really do that kind of thing. But Solomon then became king after David, and Solomon was really bad.
So why would you say that Solomon was bad? I mean, what did Solomon do that would be considered so bad?
Well, he did all those things. He pressed their sons into military service. Solomon was the first Israelite king to actually use chariots and horses. If you think about this, the Egyptians had chariots and horses when they were in Egypt. So chariots and horses were known. But every time the Israelites conquered someone, they would either kill or cripple their horses, and they would burn the chariots. It was just a thing about not using them. But Samson liked chariots. So he forced into military service sons of Israel to be his charioteers, to be the drivers, and to be the soldiers on them, and to be the guys who go before them. He had 40,000 stalls of horses. 40,000? This is Solomon. Samson. Starts with that.
Okay.
Yeah, Solomon.
Okay.
Solomon had 40,000 stalls of horses, so he needed a bunch of people just to clean out the stalls. He needed a bunch of people to feed the horses. He needed hay to feed the horses. He needed a lot of charioteers. All these people were being pressed into service. He needed all of his household and all of these military people and all these guys who cleaned out the stalls to be fed. So the women were pressed into service to cook and bake. He confiscated lands from the people. He confiscated crops. He confiscated livestock. He imposed forced labor on, we're going to have to redo this entirely. He imposed forced labor on all the people. Men were the ones predominantly for this, to build a temple. Hundreds of thousands of men got pushed into basically slave labor to build his great temple. He levied taxes on the people to support his 1,000 wives and all the children that his 1,000 wives had, and all the help that they needed to take care of housing and babies and everything else. These were the wives, by the way, that came mostly from other countries. And they were worshiping foreign gods, which eventually kind of led to Solomon's demise in the end, that because he began worshiping these foreign gods with his wives. He levied more taxes on the people to support a big bureaucracy that he set up to administer the unified Israel. So he did all these things, and it was very, very oppressive for the people. The funny part is that even though he did all those horrible things, that's not how he's remembered. That's not what he's remembered for. He's remembered as a great king. And I'd like to know how you can explain that.
Good question, Mary. Well, Solomon is best known for his wisdom. That's one of the key ideas that we get from Scripture, from Solomon, is, oh, Solomon was wise. One of my favorite songs is from Fiddler on the Roof, and Tevye is singing, and in his song, he says he wants to be kind of like Solomon the Wise. That's a key phrase in that song. We have to remember that Solomon is reigning with wisdom granted by God.
Yes.
Solomon didn't just have wisdom and, oh, I'm a wise king and that's the end of that. No, he asked for it and God granted it to best serve his kingdom peoples. So God grants Solomon wisdom so that he can serve his people.
Do we have any story about that in the Bible?
We do, actually. It comes from 1 Kings 3, verses 4 through 10. So listen to what is shared with us today. Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of his father David, only he sacrificed and offered incense at the high places. The king went to Gibeon and to sacrifice there, for that was the principal high place Solomon used to offer 1,000 burnt offerings on that altar. At Gibeon, the Lord appeared to Solomon in a dream by night, and God said, "Ask what I should give you." And Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant, my father David, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart towards you, and you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne today. And now, O Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David. Although I am only a little child, I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of the people whom you have chosen, a great people, so numerous they cannot be numbered or counted. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind." Let me reread that. "Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, able to discern between good and evil. For who can govern this, your great people?" It pleased the Lord that Solomon had asked this. Now, one of the things in reading, and I didn't bring it with me, but there's a great commentary. It's an older commentary, but one that I while reading, had two sentences that popped up and really grabbed my attention. And that was in the fact that as God is asking Solomon in his dream, the words here are, "Ask what I shall give you." But in the commentary that we read, it asks, God, in God's voice, he's asking Solomon, "Ask what I should gift you. What gift would you like for me to share with you?" And I think in reading that and in hearing Solomon's response, which was to hear that he wanted wisdom shared of heart. He wanted to have a wise heart for God's kingdom. As opposed to just wisdom and discernment, he wanted a heart.
Talk about that word heart a minute. It's one of the things that we talked about. The Hebrew word actually means both mind, which is how it gets translated in the NRSV, and heart, and inner being. The Jews, the Hebrews, the language doesn't have a dualistic nature for people. There's no split between mind and heart. It's who you are. So very holistic is
Holistic, yeah.
And there's no physical and spiritual. That all comes out of the Greek era. The Greeks came up with all that dualism. But in the Hebrew world, people were whole. So it gets translated sometimes as mind, which does sound very sort of almost academic, but it also has the meaning of heart and the idea of compassion.
The King James has heart.
Yeah, okay, good, yeah. So Solomon gets wisdom and he becomes a great king. Do we have any examples of his great wisdom?
We do. As a matter of fact, the same chapter, but a few verses later, we get to verse 16. So 1 Kings 3:16 through 28 says this. Later, 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The Lord,
I can hear you.
I know. It's not good enough. I was doing so well, too. All right, let's
It's
try that again.
important that we have fun.
Yes, that is important. So later, 2 women who were prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Please, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth while she was in the house." Then on the third,
I can hear.
It's been distracted.
Then on the 3rd day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth. We were together, there was no one else with us in the house. Only the 2 of us were in the house. Then this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. She got up in the middle of the night and took my son from beside me while your servant slept. She laid him at her breast and laid her dead son at my breast. When I rose in the morning to nurse my son, I saw that he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, clearly it was not the son I had born. But the other woman said, "No, the living son is mine and the dead son is yours." The first said, "No, the dead son is yours and the living son is mine." So they argued before the king. Then the king said, "The one says, 'This is my son that is alive and your son is dead,' while the other says, 'Not so. Your son is dead and my son is the living one.'" So the king said, "Bring me a sword." And they brought a sword before the king. The king said, "Divide the living boy in 2, then give half to the one and half to the other." But the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because compassion for her son burned within her, "Please, my lord, give her the living boy. Certainly do not kill him." The other said, "It shall be neither mine nor yours. Divide it." Then the king responded, "Give the first woman the living boy. Do not kill him. She is his mother." All Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to execute justice. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. So he was really wise. Kind of a risky move on his part.
Very risky, but that's why he's so well known for having that forethought of going, somehow one of these 2 ladies' true colors will show, and we'll know how to go from there. It'd have been interesting to see what would have happened had that not been so. But okay, so God gave Solomon wisdom that made him a great king. But what's that got to do with us here today?
Okay, so one of the things we talked about a lot this week was wisdom. We just really focused on the wisdom part. And we need wisdom in our lives.
What, today?
Yeah, it does.
It is?
Yeah. Yeah, very definitely. And the need for wisdom, so we thought about this, the need for wisdom actually grows as you get older. Because when you start out when you're Zoe's size, when you're tiny, there's someone else looking out for you and making sure you don't do anything foolish and caring for you. And as you get older, Connor's size, a little older, you start to take more and more responsibility and learn some wisdom. You don't, put your finger in an electric socket and things like this. But you start to learn things and gain some wisdom. And as you get older and older, you're a young adult, you really, in our culture, you're doing a lot on your own. And as you get old enough to have your own children, you're no longer even just wise for yourself, but now you're also responsible for children. You have to be wise for them. And for those of us who have very elderly parents, you sometimes have to be wise for them. It's really hard. There's so many things. We think sometimes of wisdom being something that we get individually, especially stories like Samson. Samson gets wisdom, and he gets it from God. we can all get wisdom from God, but it also can be less of an individual thing and more of a group thing, or a thing where you might hear wisdom from somebody else. Sometimes when God speaks to us wisdom, He speaks through some expected places. You might have a mentor or a teacher who gives you wisdom, and you kind of look for it there. But sometimes somebody you don't know, or a young child, will speak great wisdom to you. Or somebody, God forbid, that you really have always disagreed with will suddenly say something that you really have to recognize as really wise. You have to always be open to that. So,
And I think it's also important, one of the things that you and I discussed was that wisdom, compassion, love, understanding, all of that is shared, but it's not just something that we see as neighbors, as human on human. You brought up the idea of expanding it to the creative, or the creation world around us,
right.
the world of creation. So the wisdom is, and I think we've had a lack of wisdom there, in how we've treated our earth, with all the plastics that are found in the water, with acidic rain and the loss of rainforest, which also equals the loss of oxygen. So, I mean, if we don't take care of our environment, then we ourselves are kind of signing our own death warrants, so to speak.
Yes.
And one of my favorites is the idea and the image, because this happens all the time, of someone like our own Susan Cairns, who works for the Sea Turtle Inc. For those volunteers who are out there watching these areas that they know there are hidden or buried eggs of turtles waiting to hatch, and they are there waiting for these hatchlings to come out so that they can provide a safe kind of a, hey, don't touch, don't get near, don't contaminate these little guys as
Sea turtle nursery.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
As they make their way into the water.
The other thing, we had a presbytery meeting Friday and Saturday morning, and I spent almost all of Friday, listening to two of our mission workers who came here from Indonesia. They've been in Indonesia for many years. In fact, a woman was born and raised there. And the work that they do is reconciliation. They're both professors in universities there, but the work that they do there, the wonderful work that they do there, is reconciliation. So, just to give you a little background, Indonesia has 260 million people, that little string of islands. 17,000 islands, by the way. 260 million people. There are 25 million Christians. There are 200 million Muslims. So much of the work that they're doing, there are also Hindus, there are Buddhists, but much of the work that they're doing is interfaith reconciliation. And they talked a lot about the things that they've done and how they've been led to do them. And again, when you think of God's leading us and how that often happens through other people, they've had things where people came and asked them to do something simple sometimes, and they do it, but it blossoms into something much bigger. They were offered housing in the Christian section when there are 3 universities. They began at the Christian university, and they had an offer to live in the safe Christian section. And they said, no, we need to live out with people. And they got a house. They have many, many Muslim neighbors, and they have opened that house up for children's programs. And as when there were natural disasters, they were cooking there to feed people. And, they very much are people who people know and go to, and something begins, and a great reconciliation begins. They've done so much wonderful work. But there's a side to this that is what I like to think of as imaginative wisdom, where we have to be able to imagine that something can work, or that we can do something, or that there can be a peace. In this country, I don't know that we have that kind of imagination anymore. We're so polarized, and we're also literal. We don't have imagination anymore. And I think imagination is an important part of wisdom. You know, Solomon would not have been able to come up with the trial that he did with that baby without imagination. To be able to look at something. We think of it as thinking outside the box. It's that kind of a thing. But it's kind of almost bigger than just thinking outside the box. One of the things that other people that spoke at our press training was Bill Reagan from Loaves and Fishes, and he reminded us about the story of the sheep and the goats. And it struck me that we need to internalize that story so that when we see people who are hungry or are thirsty or need clothing or need a welcome or need a visit in prison or whatever, that we see the face of Christ. And that's another aspect, I think, of imaginative wisdom, of being able to look at somebody, and as you know, people say, when you work in that kind of a ministry, many of the people you serve are people that aren't very nice, aren't necessarily polite to you. They may be, for many, many different reasons, be very hard to deal with. But you still have to look at that person and have the imagination and the wisdom to see them as Christ and serve them.
One thing that is of note during this part of our discussion is in the world today, in the news alone, just this week, we've heard of all these man-made disasters. We ourselves are violent people. We ourselves are inconsistent with our thoughts. And so you see a large amount of racism. And I love the image of hearing, you've got to look for the face of Jesus. There was in all the bad stuff that's been going on. One very cool story that I got to read about and I told you about is of a mother, a single mother with a child, and she's going to visit a doctor's office for the very first time. And she's by herself. And so the very first time you visit any doctor's office, what's the number one thing that you have to go through? Yeah, mountains of paperwork, mountains of insurance and blah, 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 this, that, and the other. So, you know, she's got a packet of paper in front of her. And she's got a sleeping child. Now, I don't see color. I'm not colorblind, but I don't see race, right? So one of the things I didn't mention was that this woman was black, and her child is multiracial, is what the story said, which doesn't mean anything to me because a child and a mother are a child and a mother regardless. But apparently there was a gentleman, a white gentleman, sitting a little ways away from them, and he sees that she's trying to juggle a sleeping kid. And
we can illustrate this.
So she's trying to hold on to a baby while trying to fill out a form. I don't even think there was a clipboard, so she's trying to do it, you know, and it's kind of hard. So the gentleman comes over and goes, "Would you mind if I were to just hold your baby while you did your paperwork?" And so this lady took a candid shot. She didn't ask for permission or anything, but she took a picture and she posted it to Facebook. And in the picture, you just see the gentleman just holding that kid, and his face is just full of love. Doesn't really care that the child is not his, doesn't care that the child's of a different race. But the lady who took the picture says, you just see him loving on that child as if it were his own. And that to me was the face of Jesus right there. So what does wisdom share or call us to in times of terrorism and bigotry and just an overall sense of, arrogance or What is wisdom calling us to in today's life? It's to be Christ with one another.
Right, with whoever God puts in front of us. Yes. There's another good story, and this was from several years back, right after 9/11, when there was so much hatred against Muslims, it just was horrible. There were there was an article, and you mentioned this, about some Muslims, I guess they were praying,
Right.
and there was a ring of Christians around them, protecting them from people who wanted to attack them.
They were trying to stone them, throw objects at them.
Yeah. And the Christians stood as a ring around them. And not too long after that, I think it was, there was a synagogue that was burned down. I think this happened in Dallas, somewhere up in northern Texas, I believe. And one of the first people to respond was the local Muslim imam, who came over with a key to their mosque with, permission for them to use it until they can rebuild their synagogue. I mean, there's these stories all around us, and there's opportunities all around us. All of you who are watching this, all that noise was our favorite little child. She's got the face of Christ. So, there's many, many things. But then we have to think about, okay, so we're called to do this. Where do we get this wisdom? Sometimes we get it from other people, but can we kind of like dial into God like Solomon did and get something directly?
Yes, we can. And it's as simple as, hi God, how can I, and you can finish that thought.
Prayer you're talking about.
Yeah.
Prayer.
What a concept. We turn directly to God for help. Jesus is always with us. This is something that we know. We just need to take the time not only to ask of God, but also to, that's it right there, see what she's right there. Listen to God. Or listen for God's responses, which sometimes come as silence. They come in dreams. It comes in opportunities of service to God and to one another.
And in words, we can speak to us, and actions, yes.
And in the laughing and crying and the noise that babies make.
Yes. So one of the Bibles that I have way more Bibles than any person should own, but one of them that I have is a study Bible from Renovari, and it's called the Spiritual Formation Bible. And the editors of that Bible say that the Bible is all about human life with God, and that God made this with God life possible. They say that the entire focus of the Bible is the development of this with God life, centered in the person of Jesus, Emmanuel, which means God is with us. And we really love that phrase, the with God life.
So we have to ask, what's it like to live this with God life? Specifically, how can we live this with God life?
Yeah, I think one of the ways we live it is through experiences that we have of the Holy Spirit. And for everyone, I suppose this is different, and you might have an experience and not even really think of it that way. There's a story that's across all the synoptic gospels, little brief thing where Jesus says to the disciples, you're going to go out in the world and you're going to have trouble. They're going to arrest you, or they're going to harass you for working for the kingdom of God. And what he says to them is, don't worry about what you're going to say or how you're going to say it, because the Spirit of God will help you. Will give you the words. And this little story is in Matthew and Mark and in Luke. And it's always struck me as a very calming thing, because if you think about, especially Presbyterians, we're not used to going out and evangelizing or doing anything like that. But little by little, we learn to walk. Look at that. Zoe just walked. Anyhow, one of the things that it can give you is kind of an assurance that when you need to, you'll be given those words. And I've actually had that experience where, most notably, when I was in seminary, and I was in Austin, Eric was at our home in Ingram, except he came in on weekends. We had a great system. I sent home all my dirty laundry with him. He did all the laundry and brought back clean laundry, and the dogs.
I have to say, it's important for those of you watching at home to know that Eric is Mary's husband.
Yes, sorry.
It's kind of weird for an Eric just to show up and get laundry, and this is my pastor's husband.
Yeah, that's my
husband.
Part-time overtime.
But I have to also explain that my husband did not grow up in the church, and he really didn't trust Christians, didn't really feel comfortable with Christians.
There you go.
And So he would come in on Fridays and I would basically pour dump my week's classes at him. You know, everything that we'd heard and said and talked about kind of all came rushing out on Friday night. And sometimes he would actually ask questions. He started listening and he started asking questions. And I didn't always know the answers to his questions, or I'd think, oh, I know that, but I don't know how to say it. I don't know how to explain it so that it doesn't like either bore him or turn him off or whatever. And there were times where I would answer a question, and after I'd answered it, I would really have wondered where the answer would come from, because, and now I'm not saying I speak with God's voice or anything like that, I'm not claiming that kind of privilege, but just that those words were given to me to explain things in ways that made sense. And when I worked in a state hospital as a volunteer chaplain for almost a year, while I was looking for a call, and over again in that context, God gave me the words to say, or the strict message to keep my mouth shut when I needed to be kept shut. And I thank God for those times. There's many times when God has helped us. So Bob, do you have any ideas about how we can share this with God life with people? Do you remember you got that question?
I don't remember getting that question. Oh yes, I do remember getting that question. I just have to turn the page. So one of the things that I picked up on our notes during our study of this scripture and in our discussions, and you have to realize that it's not just Mary and myself. Our preaching team is a total of 4 of us. So there's 2 others that are not here today, but who've participated and gave us some really good thought, or food for thought. But one of the things that came of the conversation, and this is, I think, an idea that came out of one of your study resources, but the question is, how can we share this with God life, with others? And it is to listen. To really listen when people are talking to you. When people are needing wisdom. And it's also to listen, and I like how you put really listen. So the first one is really listen, the second one is listen really. And I like how that changes the meaning of it, because it does. Now you're wanting to listen for the Spirit's urging, for the Spirit's work among us, for that breath of encouragement, that breath of life, that wind, that rushing wind sound that's associated with the Spirit, to talk or to remain silent and to listen some more before we are to speak. And like I've shared with you all before, the story of Mother Teresa is sometimes all you're doing is listening, and no one's really doing much talking. But a lot is being said in conversation during silence. So we are to encourage others to listen for God's word. So I encourage you all at home, to listen for God's voice to you. Seek God's wisdom. Be the wise friend who shares your own experiences. But you want to be. This is one of my favorites, is people sometimes sometimes people get in trouble because they offer advice that wasn't really asked for. But when you're really close friends and you see something, what is it that we now say is like, you see a need, you feel a need, you offer, but in a loving, caring way, not a, well, if I were you, I would. Yeah. Don't be judgy. Don't be judgy. Rather, be help.
She's driving the tomato man.
Yes, she's driving the tomato now. She's looking at your purple heart.
So one of the other things, we're probably kind of wrapping up here, but there was a thing where the missionaries, the mission workers from Indonesia said that, the motto, I guess you would say, of Indonesia is, we are many, but we are one. And someone else at the Presbyterian meeting made the comment, every time someone new enters a group, the group is new. And those two things kind of made me think more about our congregation. And anytime anyone walks in the door and joins us, this is way more fun than the tomato, isn't it? Yes. anytime we add another person, anytime we do something like that, anytime we have a child who needs to go sit with Uncle Bob,
Put it down inside.
we have a new group, and we have new voices and new people to listen to, and new opportunities for helping, for service, for reconciliation, both for those people and with those people outside the church.
Yes.
Yes. So you guys have any questions?
That's a first for us, isn't it?
That's
Just
it,
ask.
Yeah,
We mean it.
yeah, we mean it, we do.
Yeah, so I was listening to your, what is it that we can, do nowadays, or
Yeah. What can we do nowadays?
is, like Solomon asked for the wisdom.
Ask
Asked
for
for it.
Yes.
So that when we're in that situation as the man with the baby, that we answer that wisdom that he gave us, what you do with it.
It's important to note, though, also that once you ask, you take the time to stop, discern, and listen for the reply. Because it won't always come with a big thundering voice from heaven. Sometimes it'll be a dream or an opportunity. That's why it's my standard practice not to ask God for patience.
That's it.
I'm not going to deal with that.
I mean, I think a lot of us have the habit of asking for something and assuming that because I've asked for it, A, I'm entitled to it, and B, I will get it. Neither of which is necessarily true. Yes, yes, there's still a discernment process. But asking God for help with that discernment process.
How about, because you mentioned, loving our neighbors, but there are some of our neighbors that are very hard to love.
Yes.
So how do we?
Yes.
Well,
We love them from a distance.
From from a distance.
right.
Well, you do. You have to just do what you can. I used to tutor in an ESL program. I was a Russian major as an undergraduate, and I was working in a group that worked with recent Russian immigrants to this country. And I had an elderly man once who sat and argued with me about how English words were pronounced because he thought he knew. And what he had was Russian versions of British pronunciations of words. And some of the other Russians there trying to convince him, no, you're not in the UK, you're in America, and it's really pronounced differently here. And he just, yelled at them and he yelled at me. And, there's a point where you're helping someone and, you just roll with it. You just smile. And you can only do what you can do. And when it gets to you, you go distance. Yeah. You do what you can where you can. But what I've always found is that there have been people in my life where I didn't really care for much, or found them troublesome in some way. But what I've always found is if I learn a little bit about them, like if I even just talk to them for a few minutes and just find out even one little thing, I start to like them better. It's almost like when you get to know somebody and you know something about them, there's the beginning of a bond. And you know how you can have like a relative that you really don't like, but you deal with them because you know it and you've got a bond and you've got a reason to. And even strangers, that can happen. But again, we're called to do what we're able to. I don't think there's not anything to be gained from pushing something with someone where it's just a collide in the middle.
And I think it's important also to know who your neighbors are. So getting to know them should be true of everybody. Whether we like them or not, we need to know our neighbors, otherwise they're just that guy that's
Yes.
or that gal who is in line with If you don't get to know your community, if you don't get to know your neighborhood,
Yes.
as I love to talk about community, then you're really kind of missing out on a whole lot. And God and Jesus have asked us not to do that. They've asked us instead to know our neighbor, to love our neighbor as ourselves. So how do you love somebody without really getting to know them? Aside from, yes, I'm giving you the cup of cold water because it is demanded of me
Yeah.
by Scripture.
Yeah.
When I give you a cup of cold water, I mean it. I want to share.
I lived at one point in a neighborhood that I was renting. The realtor said it was an integrated neighborhood. She meant if I moved in. So I was in an apartment. Everyone else in the neighborhood was black, which didn't bother me. But I didn't really reach out. I was commuting to a job a long ways away, and I mostly just came and went. I knew the people who lived right below me, but not anybody else. One of the men who lived actually his mother lived in the house next door, came to my door one day. And when I went down, he introduced himself and he said, "I just found out you've never been over to see us. I want you to know you're welcome." And it was just such a neat thing for him to do, just to come over and make sure that I knew I was welcome. Because not everybody in the neighborhood really felt that way. But really, it makes a difference just to do even something little. Even if nobody follows up on it, even if that's all there is to it. Somebody made an interesting comment, I guess this morning over at Second Presbyterian, that numbers aren't what's important. Numbers aren't what's important in a congregation. Numbers aren't what's important in a mission work. What's important is the impact that we make. So we have, if we have 5 people here, we have more than that. We have more than that. But if you only have 5 people, it's not that you get 10 people or 20 people. It's that you make an impact with the people that you have. And I think the same is true of individual things that we do. It's not that you go out and you ring the doorbell of every neighbor, but that when you see your neighbors, you have a smile. And that either makes their day or it doesn't. You don't have any control over that. But even just looking back, that person may actually have felt better even if they don't want to admit it,
If you are going to go and ring your neighbor's doorbell, don't do ding dong ditch. Is that what they're calling it?
I don't know, what is it?
Ring the doorbell and run.
Oh, no.
Don't do that.
Not in Texas, not with the guns like that. I think we're done. Unless you have any questions?
I was just watching Zoe, we were all sort of watching this child, and all of a sudden, we realized Zoe wasn't around. Where was Zoe? And it's like all of a sudden, I know Lynn sort of did one of these, and I did one of these. It takes a village to raise a child. We've all heard that. What is a church but a village? That's what a church should be. It's a community that comes together a couple times a week. And if somebody's not there, we don't know why. What's the first thing that happens? I get a phone call. "Julia, are you okay?" "Yeah, but it's a village. She's been born into a village. She doesn't know it yet. But once she figures it out, and she's already learned that she can come to whoever around the village.
Yes.
It's cool.
And eat their name tag.
And eat their name tag. She doesn't care.
That's okay. We're
But
going to make more.
it's a village, and when we learn to grow our children in a village, such as the church, that church is going to flourish. I don't care what. Other than that, it doesn't matter. I don't care that there's 2 or 3. God said if there's 2 or 3 in my name, I'm there. That's fine.
And I think for this community, for our neighborhood here
Yeah.
of New Hope, we've discussed this before at length, and that is we pray for growth, but we really, sure, numbers in the pews and the chairs would be appreciated and welcome, but if that's not the growth that we are going to be gifted with, I'm okay with that. I'm okay with being gifted with a more spiritual understanding, a more spiritual growth.
Fruits down instead of
Exactly.
That's correct.
If I'm growing in community with my neighbors in this neighborhood, that's okay too. It doesn't matter that we got X, Y, Z or 1, 2, 3 numbers in the chairs. It's that we are still a valid ministry.
What about numbers? I don't know why we have to worry about numbers. Why don't we worry more about the people?
It's kind of tradition,
It's
I think.
social and tradition.
Yeah, it's tradition. Also out of good morale.
Numbers translates to money.
Yeah, numbers translates to money.
And,
But we always find a way to survive.
and one of the things that we're constantly hearing as one of the things that we kept hearing at Presbytery is the frozen chosen. Another phrase that we keep repeating or hearing is, well, that's the way we've always done it.
Yeah.
It's always been done that way. Well, I put forth for you when we talk about numbers and wanting people in that's the way we've always thought about it.
Yeah.
And now we fall into the creativity. We need to be more creative with how we're viewing growth. What does growth mean? Our doors are welcome. Our YouTube page is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You know, pose questions, ask us, talk to us, give us ideas. Be part of the church and be part of the creativity that is this community.
I answered a question to my sister Norma. She says, "You still going there?" And she was going to another church. I said, "Yeah." She goes, "So what do you do?" I was like, "Actually, it's growing my wisdom and things that I did not know." She was like what? You know, like we talked like she was like, "What? Like you've been in the church a long time." I said, "Worshiping a different way and still getting the felt and getting that." She was like, "Oh wow, okay." Well, she comes.
Did we scare her
It's
off?
how you answer. No.
I wondered if the Presbyterian meeting was just like,
Oh no.
ah.
But it's all in
These
what
committee people.
you get out of, where you go, and then how you answer the question that is put before you. That's where the wisdom comes in. And he says, "I will teach you, and I will give you what you need to say." So, for me, I wasn't expecting to come out like, I learned this, but that's the way it came out. So,
I've always said that the thing that I love most about the church is that we don't have to sit straight-laced in our pews, and we can just talk in an open forum, and nobody seems to worry about that. I have been in churches, larger churches, that if you did this, everybody would stare at you going, "What are you doing?" We don't do this. We don't talk like this. Then you're not sharing ideas and you're not learning from each other. Yes, Zoe, we're learning about you every day, though.
God is good.
All the time.